Welcome back, Chappelle. Oh my God, it was so great to see all of you today. My G period really quick. I know I haven't seen you yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again. It's really a great feeling when you come back to school after not being here for a week and you felt like break was super short, but then you immediately become happy because you got to see your students, right? So you guys are killing it. You're doing so well. So impressed by all y'all. And y'all did so well on that quiz, which is awesome. So I can see that you're studying and you're doing what you're supposed to. Very proud. Keep up the hard work, okay? Now, just to give you a heads up, though, we left off right about here in class. I know my B period's like, we got further than this. It's okay, so just go forward a little bit until you find where we left off, okay? Now, what we did cover, though, is we were talking about how the Reformation is spreading, right, throughout Europe, and it is going to hop from the Holy Roman Empire right over into England, right? It's going to head over to England, and it's going to be creating this thing known as the Anglican Church. And it's going to be created by your boy, Henry VIII. Henry VIII, also known as Henry Tudor, is his last name. The Tudor dynasty, which was a large result of the War of the Roses between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, right? So, now originally, as we talked about in class, Henry VIII was known as the defender of the faith because he actually stood up for Catholicism in the face of Luther, but then everything's going to go sideways when he wants to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon because the only thing she gave him was a daughter named Mary, right? He wants this annulled so he can have a new wife and hopefully have a boy, and the Pope at the time says no. And just like Darius, he is very upset. All right, so now really quick though, Henry VIII is going to reform Parliament and he creates this church known as the Church of England. And we talked about Henry VIII a little bit in class. We talked about his personality. We talked about his ulcery, gross legs. We talked about how he was not a catch in his older years, but he was when he was young. And then what ends up happening though is he does create this new church, right? And this new church is referred to as the Anglican Church, right? The Anglican Church. And in the Anglican Church, it's basically just Diet Catholic, right? It's a very simple form of Catholicism where they believe they still do the Eucharist and the Mass, and early on, priests weren't allowed to marry, but then later on, he did allow this. He's going to do a lot of other crazy stuff that we talk about in AP, but we don't necessarily need to talk about here, like he abolishes monasteries. They go from like stone altars to wooden altars and like all this other little stuff, little piddly things here and there, but basically Anglicanism early on under Henry VIII was just like Diet Catholic. But one big thing that they did allow that the Catholics did not was divorce and annulment at a much faster pace, right? So Henry is going to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry this woman named Anne Boleyn. Now, for those of you who are already a little bit further ahead, something very important that you need to remember here and or understand, because I guarantee you I got some super nerds like Alyssa or Ashley or Ava that are listening to this right now, even though we went over it in class, because they're seeing if I missed something or skipped over something. But what happens to Catherine? What happens to Catherine now that this divorce or this marriage has been divorced and you go off and you marry this woman named Anne Boleyn, who was apparently one of Catherine's best friends and ladies in waiting, which is a very important thing to understand. A lady in waiting is basically the daughter of a noble who was destined to either marry a court member or possibly a king or prince later in life, right? Lady in waiting as in waiting to be wed. So now, interestingly enough, though, Catherine is going to be banished with Mary all the way over to this place called Essex in England, right? And she's going to be forced under house arrest and not allowed to leave, and her and Mary never stop being Catholic. So it is very important that we understand that. But Anne Boleyn gets pregnant. Hooray, good stuff. But because Henry VIII's genetic material is so weak, not that having women makes you a weak genetic material person. We just know that over time it showed signs that it actually was not his wife's fault. It was probably his fault genetically that he kept having all these girls and these stillbirths and things like that. But what does he end up having? A girl, right? And that girl is going to be Elizabeth the First, who is very connected to our country in a way because the state of Virginia is named in her honor, right? And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on. So what is Henry left with now? He's got 2 daughters and an ex-wife and a current wife, and he's still mad because what does he want? He wants a boy, right? But in the process of all this stuff, while all this craziness is going on, while he's still married to Anne Boleyn, he decides to pass a law, and also he plans to get remarried yet again, right? So, and the law that he passes is known as the Act of Supremacy, right? And in the Act of Supremacy, he requires every single subject of England to take an oath declaring that Henry VIII will be the supreme head of the Church of England, right? So this makes him basically the Pope of the Anglican Church, right? No longer is there a Pope in Italy that controls the Catholic faith that existed in England. Now you're Anglican, okay? And the supreme head of your church is now Henry himself, which is a very interesting political dynamic because, like we said, a lot of this as time went on was much more political and much less religious, right? And that is really important to understand when we talk about the 30 Years' War later on and how it's going to shift dramatically. And a lot of these things end up just being very political because Henry wanted to make himself the supreme head of the church so he could control not only the politics of England, but also the faith of England as well. Now, the interesting part about this as well is that you were no longer allowed to be Catholic because of this act. You had to swear to him being his allegiance, and you also had to promise to break from the Holy Roman Church, right? You were breaking away from the Catholic Church completely. Catholics were now pretty much illegal in England, right? Some of his advisors are going to refuse to do this, like Sir Thomas More. This is a very, very famous one, a guy who wrote this famous book called The Utopia, which was a direct criticism of Catholicism at the time, but he stayed and remained Catholic, much like Desiderius Erasmus did before him. And the big thing about it, Sir Thomas More says, I don't think you should get divorced from Catherine, I don't think you should marry Anne, and I'm not taking this stinking oath, and he ends up losing his noggin, right? And he was not alone. Several of his advisors were beheaded because they refused to take the act of supremacy, or the oath of allegiance is what it's called. Now, when Anne, though, refused to annul their marriage, right? So after the act of supremacy and after the oath of allegiance happens, Anne looks at Henry and says, I don't want to get a divorce. I want to keep trying. I want to try again. I want to see if we can have another child, right? I want to see if I can have a boy. She is then going to be accused by Henry because of his toxic masculinity and all of his gross habits where he's like wrestling princes of France, trying to prove how manly he is and then losing, which is hilarious. But big thing, though, when Anne Boleyn, actually, if you're interested in that, the wrestling match between Francis and Henry, you can drop down into the comment or into the description below, and there's actually a video that I'm going to clip in that you can actually watch if you want to understand more about it. Now, when Anne Boleyn refused to annul their marriage, she was charged with incest, as in sleeping with her brother, witchcraft, which is disputed, but some people say that she was charged with witchcraft because she had like 6 fingers on one hand and all this other crazy stuff, adultery, and also treason. And Anne Boleyn would be beheaded. So let's look at the wives so far. Divorced, beheaded, right? So divorced, beheaded. So he has to go off and get married again, and so he does. And on his third marriage to a woman named Jane Seymour, he has a boy, right? He finally has a boy. That's aggressive and scary looking. Okay, that's the boy himself that he ends up having. And his name is Edward, right? So, and this wife that he has it with, it's aggressive. I'm sorry, Edward. You've been dead for several hundred years, but it was not nice to call you that. But on his third marriage to Jane Seymour, Henry VIII claimed that was his one true love, right? That Jane was the woman that he was most attached to, that was his one true love. And unfortunately, while Edward is being born, Jane Seymour, his favorite wife, dies during childbirth, right? So now we've got 3 wives down, right? We've got divorced, beheaded, died, right? So divorced, beheaded, died, all right? So, and then over time, he is going to go on to have 3 more wives, right? One of them is barely even going to count as a marriage. His 4th wife is a woman named Anne of Cleves, and Anne of Cleves is actually going to be really, really kind of a sketched out whole thing that happens because what ends up occurring is, like he says, I don't like her, she's ugly, but it's a whole story too about how apparently she turned him down and stuff at this big meeting, and they just did not get along and did not get along together very well. He thought she was going to be prettier than she was, according to him, and she thought he was gross and nasty anyway, and so they never even really got together. So that's divorced again, right? So, and then number 5 apparently cheated on him with one of his most close advisors, and then she's going to be beheaded. So, and then the last one is going to end up living out her life, right? So Henry had 6 wives. Let's look at them together really fast. So we got divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Okay, say it with me again. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It's like a little song. You like that beat in the background? All right, so now anyway, but going forward, after Henry dies, one of the biggest things that happens is Henry has to do something to reform some issues that have happened, okay? Because he's left with 3 kids, right? He's got 3 kids. He's got Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, right? And Edward is going to rule for about 6 years, but really only about 9 months of a 6-year reign when he was in good health, right? So he actually really didn't even do that much in the long time, because what ends up happening is he ends up getting tuberculosis at the age of 15 and dying, okay? So jot that down really quick. Edward gets tuberculosis at 15 and dies, right? So after only about 6 years of ruling, and he tried to prevent his sister Mary from ascending the throne, but it didn't work out very well. There's this whole story about this woman named Lady Jane Grey, which of course asked me about that in class. Lady Jane Grey was supposed to be queen, and then she ends up only being queen for about 9 days. It's called the 9 Days Queen. She's executed by Mary, and all this other crazy stuff happens. But really interesting perspective that we have going on here right now. So we have Henry has his 6 wives, has 2 daughters and 1 son, right? So the son takes over for only about 6 years. When he dies, now we have an issue. The only people left to take over are women, right? So what ends up happening is Mary ends up ascending the throne because of this thing called the Third Succession Act, which went through in 1543. I think it's 1543. Now, Mary became queen and returns England to Catholicism. Now, interesting point, though, that we got to understand really quick. Mary is the very first queen and ruler and female ruler of any European country in all of history, right? So she is a pretty big deal, right? She's a very, very big deal. So let's look this up real quick. Third Succession Act, 1543. Give me 1543. Let's go, 1543. Now, really fast, though. Mary becomes queen. She's the first woman to ever ascend a throne as a female during this time period, or in European history ever, all right? Some people will argue, they'll be like, well, what about the queen regents that came before? What about Isabella d'Este? What about, several other women that were like leaders? But look, England was super powerful, right? We're talking about the first major powerful Western European country since the Middle Ages where a woman has ascended to the throne, okay? So Mary becomes queen. But she wants to get rid of Anglicanism altogether, and she wants to bring back Catholicism. Because once she is from the first marriage of Henry to Catherine, right? Henry banishes Catherine to a small house in Essex. She has to live down there and stay down there with her daughter, and Mary the entire time is just becoming more furious because she does not communicate with her father anymore, and she's kind of been abandoned by her dad. So she believes that the Anglican faith and the Anglican Church is hypocrisy and heresy against the true faith of Catholicism. So when she comes back, she burns people at the stake for not switching back to Catholicism, and it earns her the nickname Bloody Mary. That's right! That Bloody Mary is actually this Bloody Mary, right? Bloody Mary was a real person, okay? She burned people at the stake for not converting to Catholicism, right? Now, when she ascended the throne, she was a lot older. She was in her 30s, and she never actually had kids either. She did have a husband that we'll talk about later, which is very important, Philip II of Spain, but they were never able to have kids. There's rumors around that they never even attempted to have children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of other crazy stuff. But what ends up happening when she dies, right, she is just executed and burned over 300 people at the stake, which if you're going to be called Bloody Mary, I feel like you should have killed way more people than that. It just feels like you should have killed a lot more people. Now, Elizabeth, though, is going to become queen. And when Elizabeth rises to prominence, one of her biggest things she does is she takes the government and the church and she splits them, okay? Now, when I say Elizabeth became queen and split England from the church, I mean that she goes back to Anglicanism, okay? So jot that down. Elizabeth goes back to Anglicanism, and then within the power of the monarchy, she then decides that as the monarch, I am going to focus on the state and the country, and as the religious body, you will focus on that over there, right? So she separates church and state, which is very, very important. She was still technically involved. She was claimed to be the monarchs are the governor of the church, and it's where it's a window into it, but you're not actually the supreme head of it and all this other stuff. But we will talk more about Elizabeth later when we get into the era of absolutism, right? Because she's very important as a person who kind of causes this massive trend known as the absolute era, right? When kings and queens started retaining a lot of power. But really important things about Elizabeth is, one, fun fact, she never got married, and she claims that she had never felt the touch of a man, which is why Virginia is named after her, because she's oftentimes called the Virgin queen, right? So this is her right here. Very, very famous figure, very strong, powerful figure in all European history. She never allowed any man to help her rule and refused to ever get married. There was one guy that she almost married named Robert Dudley, but like she just kept him around as like her favorite and stuff. And he ended up getting married to somebody else, and he hated that girl, or she hated that woman and stuff like that. So there's a lot of like big controversies and stuff. But that's the Tudors, right? And that's the Tudors and how they took England and created yet another Protestant faith and Protestant sect within Europe. And tomorrow, we are going to talk very specifically about Calvin and his reforms that are going to happen in France and how he's just going to throw a wrench in everything, all right? So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I'll see you guys soon. Y'all have a good one. It's so enjoyed seeing y'all again. Also, really quick shout out, really, really important. The honors kids are getting ready to do their artwork presentations. A lot of them are very nervous, so if you could do me a favor, get out there, talk to any of your friends that you know are in honors and be like, hey, I can help you get ready for this thing because y'all did so well on that Renaissance art project. I want y'all to tell them that this is not hard, it's meant to be easy, it's also meant to be kind of fun, right? So go out and tell them. Emma Pullion, thank you for helping me out today with that. I really, really appreciate it. But I will talk to you guys soon, so y'all have a good one. Bye.